our society is sort of like a pill for an ill. So basically, no matter what sort of symptom or illness you're suffering with, we have a medication that will get rid of that symptom. Doctors don't have the time, especially GPs, to sit with people and coach them for 30 minutes on, oh, you should be doing this with your diet. And I guess maybe at some point it sort of started to fall on either deaf ears, where people are just adamant, give me the drug and I'm just going to live my life the way I want to. The value of nutrition playing into cardiovascular disease, thyroid health, fatty liver disease, all these disease processes coming straight back to what that person is putting into their body.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of MC Stories podcast by Mart PhD. This is episode number 51. You can listen on Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, and Breaker and Radio Public. And for this episode, I have a very special guest from Ireland. It's Dr. Dean, STM. Hey, doctor. How are you doing?
How's it going, Mario? Thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to today's chat.
How do you pronounce your last name? If I didn't pronounce it like you're Saint Mart, yeah, or St. Yeah. Mart? It's like
no Saint Mart, yeah, Dean Saint Mart.
Okay. So Dr. Saint Mart.
And I know you wanted to go into my background a little bit. So if anyone wants to know Saint Mart, my dad is from Mauritius, so I'm half Mauritian.
Oh, nice.
That's a fact that I've never stated on any podcast before. So that's where St. Mart comes from. My dad's originally from the island Mauritius.
Great. So today we have a very special guest. He's one of the smartest people I've ever seen. He's like what he knows about medicine, like true medicine and drugs, PADs, whatever, like supplements and nutrition. It's like amazing. So I believe that you will enjoy this episode and learn a lot of new stuff. And for the Slovak guys or Czech guys listening this, you can also have like subtitles on YouTube, so be sure to check that out. And right now I'm gonna give room to the doctor to introduce himself. So Doc, where are you from? Hey. Like what's your I know you have degrees like PhD and doctor, so we can talk about that, school, universities and stuff.
Yeah. So as you introduced me, I'm Dr. Dean St. Mart. I'm from Ireland, but I currently live in Northern Ireland with my wife and 2 kids. Originally, as you sort of pointed to, I wanted to originally be a medical doctor. So all throughout my high school, I was dead set on being a medical doctor, to the point when I was a little kid, like I'd be going around saying Dr. Dean, and my mum would be like laughing at it. But as I sort of got to the end of high school, I started to realize that medicine as a career didn't really seem to be something that I wanted to really go down the path of. Just mainly because of the commitments that you'd have towards your family. And I realized, it's quite an arduous training perspective. And I sort of then changed my mind and went down a route of chemistry and drug design. So I went to the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. It's in Kildare in Ireland. And I'd done a double honours degree in chemistry and pharmaceutical chemistry. So I focused mainly on pharmacology, toxicology, drug design. And with that, I ended up coming top of the university. So with that, I was offered scholarships to do a PhD. So I chose to do my PhD in synthetic organic chemistry, where I focused mainly on developing new fluorescent molecules and then studying the photophysics of why they fluoresce. So try and understand the mechanism of why these molecules glow, basically. And ultimately, then you could use these fluorescent molecules for biodiagnostics. So in other words, the last thing I sort of closed my PhD with was tagging single amino acids with this fluorescent molecule to make them glow. So in other words, if you had a certain amino acid within a protein structure, this molecule could be given and it would tag onto that amino acid in the body and allow it to be visualized, either with confocal microscopy, where you can use fluorescent imaging, or what we're sort of going down the route of is real-time investigation during surgery, where we can use fluorophores or fluorescent molecules to target benign versus, malignant tissue. And then surgeons can actually just cut away the malignant tissue that's glowing, say, red, and leave the benign tissue that's glowing, say, green. And that's sort of the sort of concept that fluorescent diagnostics is trying to go down to sort of in the future. So with that, when I finished my PhD, I was sort of left at a crossroads where I didn't really know what I wanted to do after the PhD. I didn't want to go down the route of drug design because I started to realize that people were relying on drugs to treat symptoms, and that ultimately the designers of those drugs, the pharmacologists, the chemists, were really just interested in what target was causing that symptom, as opposed to what was the root cause causing the disease. So from there, I sort of moved away from pharma and moved into chemical engineering. So I now work as a chemical engineer for Intel. And in the process of all that, so all throughout, my undergraduate degree, I was a kickboxer. And then an accident in training led to me smashing the bones of my right ankle. So I sort of moved away from kickboxing into bodybuilding. And then I was bodybuilding all throughout my PhD. And during that time, again, I'm sort of applying the same curiosity, scientific curiosity, as what I'd done during my PhD to bodybuilding. So I started to think, guys who are using PEDs or androgens are suffering disease consequences, but what's actually causing that? So you look in all the forums, you see guys saying, oh, my LDL has gone high, my HDL has gone bad, or my liver enzymes are out. But no one was actually discussing, well, what is actually happening? I mean, like, all this has been sort of studied, in the literature, but it's never been publicly made aware to the layman or, on a forum that basically this is why you're having the problem and this is how we correct it. And with that, I guess I started to post regularly on the Train by JP forum, just as a normal user. And I was just seeing guys putting stuff on the forum of, certain health problems. And then I started to make people think in that manner of what's the root cause and how do we get to the bottom of that root cause to stop the disease from progressing. And I guess then with that, I started to formulate for a company called Supplement Needs in the UK. And what that sort of stemmed from, again, was bodybuilders are probably familiar with the scenario of you buy like 10 or 12 health supplements, and in the morning you're opening up all these tubs to take all these different health supplements to offset maybe some of the negative side effects of bodybuilding. And I figured, well, no one's really gone down the route of creating stacks of, I've a stack of supplements for my lipids or my heart, for my liver, for my kidneys. And I started to put the idea forward to Lee, who owns the company, first off to do a sleep stack, which is sort of where everyone gained, I guess, my name, basically came to know who I was, because obviously the sleep stack started to change how bodybuilders slept, especially in a bodybuilding scenario. But on top of that, then we started to build, the CV stack, the liver stack, the kidney stack, in order to have one shop where people could go and buy just one set of supplements, and then didn't have to worry about opening up all these tubs. It was literally, CV stack, open this tub, take 6 capsules, done. So what that all came through was I wanted to figure out why, like I said, bodybuilders were developing certain issues, and how can we get in at the I guess, step one or the beginning phase of disease progression and stop it. So over the last, since 2016, I've been on Instagram thanks to my wife. And it was funny, like I said to you before we come on, my wife is sort of the one people have to thank for me being on social media, because when I first met her, she started to see everything I was chatting to her about, and obviously what knowledge I had in terms of health and disease prevention in terms of bodybuilding. And she figured, you shouldn't really be keeping this to yourself. Yes, guys would come up to me in the gym and ask me questions, or, within the Irish bodybuilding community, they'd ask me questions. But she said, you should really try and get to like a global platform and start doing what some other guys are doing. And that's really educate people to prevent them from actually getting sick. Because, I mean, when you have kids and you bodybuild, your mentality sort of should shift towards, bodybuilding is sort of a short-term thing. I need to be thinking of where I'm going to be when I'm in my mid-40s or late 40s, when bodybuilding is sort of, competitive bodybuilding is sort of done at that point. I need to ensure that what health decisions I make during my 20s and 30s don't impact the 40s, 50s, and 60s when I'm going to try and enjoy time with my kids. And that's sort of where I started to speak out on social media, and especially, like I said, on Jordan Peters' forum of, what you've all been led to believe towards health issues on forums and how to address them is flawed ultimately, because no one's ever sat down and said, right, your HDL, for example, within your lipid panel is low when you're taking PEDs. And that's well understood, because when you have super physiological levels of testosterone or androgens in your body, it causes the upregulation, so you make more of an enzyme called hepatic lipase. And hepatic lipase is what breaks down HDL in your liver. So if you're making more of the enzyme that breaks it down, you're never going to have high HDL. So it's a matter of then, coaching people in and saying, this is where it's important that you come back to physiological levels of testosterone in order to allow that enzyme production in the liver to be suppressed, allow your HDL to rise, have a period where your lipid recycling in your body is back to how it should be when you're at natural baseline. And then, from there, push your dose back up again if needed, if you're willing to take that risk again when things have sort of baselined out back to normal. So this whole getting to the root cause has been my mission, to educate people in bodybuilding and make them aware that, we don't have to suffer the ill consequences of bodybuilding if we're smart in the decisions we make. And it's sort of like, if you don't choose to make those smart decisions, then ultimately it's your responsibility when you do suffer illness. So that's sort of where we are today over the last, 4 or 5 years of where I've sort of gained my popularity on social media or even in the fitness industry. And I often say, it's a little surreal that people stop me and, know who I am within the fitness industry, because I just started all this as a hobby and just basically just to make sure guys weren't dying in their 40s.
Yeah. And that's like what I love about you, man, is that like you had two options. Like you could develop medicine for just treating the symptoms but not curing the disease. But you chose the right opposite way and started helping people addressing the root cause. Like that's like crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, like, then it was even like the sleep stack, like I said, when I was sort of on that tangent, was my first experience of trying to figure out problems for myself as a bodybuilder. So I worked as a shift engineer for 7 years. And during that time, I was competing. So I'd done, I think, 3 or 4 preps during that time, working shifts. So a month of day shift and a month of night shift, rotating 12-hour shifts, 7 to 7, and I was still able to prep. Now, what I did realize then was, obviously, the information that you're given when you go on shift by occupational health within companies isn't entirely correct. There's a lot of nuances to night shifts and in terms of the circadian rhythm that we need to be aware of. And like we had the chat at the start, your nutrition plays a huge role, because when you're working night shifts, your circadian rhythm doesn't magically swap over to changing how your body digests food in the middle of the night. Your digestive processes completely slow down at nighttime. So you need to be mindful of the certain foods that you're going to ingest when you're working night shift and the timings of those foods. And I guess I was very fortunate because we had a gym at work. So you could train in the middle of the night. So you could then offset some of the negative side effects of the circadian imbalance because you were training in the middle of the night. Your glucose uptake changed. So obviously, if you're eating post-workout carbohydrates in response to training, that sort of offset how your body doesn't produce as much insulin during the nighttime. So with that sort of boxed off, sleep then became an issue, obviously, with preps. And anyone who gets to, like, you know, striated glute body fat level will understand that your sleep severely suffers. So your sleep latency, how long it takes you to fall asleep, suffers, but also your time asleep also suffers. So you tend to have, I guess, shorter periods of sleep as opposed to when you're in off season when your sleep is a lot longer, basically. So I had to figure out a way to optimize my sleep when I was working night shift. And that led me down the path of, okay, what's the mechanisms of sleep? What causes us to fall asleep? What causes us to stay asleep? And I started to then see, you know, the biochemistry of what feeds into sleep. What are the neurotransmitters? What are the cofactors, the vitamins? And understanding that, yes, we can take medicines like benzodiazepines or barbiturates that basically just take a hammer to your head and don't necessarily put you asleep, but just knock you out. So your brain actually never goes through the alpha, beta, and theta stages of brain waves that happens when you're normal sleep. You just have this period where you're just knocked out for 6 hours. So you don't have any of the, you don't have any of the, I guess, regular growth hormone secretion that you'd normally get if you had normal deep sleep. You don't feel as rested when you wake up. All that you will experience is that your eyes won't be as tired. And so with that, I started to look at how can I optimize my sleep? Not in terms of like sleep hygiene that I started, first talking about when people were looking to use the sleep stack. And obviously sleep hygiene is the rituals that you do before you go to sleep to ensure that you've wound your brain down to help bring on that sleep onset. But from a neurochemical perspective, what makes your brain relax? What makes your brain stay relaxed and stay asleep? And that's sort of where we start to understand serotonin's involvement, dopamine's involvement, and then obviously people are probably aware of melatonin. And so if you work shift and you take melatonin, most of the time it'll give you like 3 hours sleep. You take 5 to 10 milligrams of melatonin, yes, it will make you fall asleep, but it won't keep you asleep.
Short half-life, right?
Yeah, the half-life is about 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours. So you're talking literally 3 or 4 hours and you're down to maybe 1 milligram in your system. And that's when your body wakes up because melatonin is no longer being driven as being produced by your own body. And that's where the design of the sleep stack come in, was that what we want to do here is increase serotonin in the brain so that we feel relaxed, decrease dopamine so we don't have these racing thoughts when we're lying in bed and we're overthinking everything, help the nervous system to relax and let the brain sort of fall into this alpha wave brain pattern so that we start to fall into that sort of light sleep phase. And then make sure that whatever serotonin we make gets converted to melatonin, because one of the overall pictures is how the pineal gland stores and creates melatonin during the day from sunlight is important to make you fall asleep at nighttime, because obviously with the circadian rhythm. But how your body keeps you asleep then is all reliant on your serotonin level. And that's obviously the serotonin being converted through an enzyme in the body to melatonin. And obviously if you have low serotonin, your melatonin is going to suffer. But if you've also low vitamin B5, which is what that conversion process relies on, is low also, you're going to have low melatonin as well. So that sort of thought process was what went into the sleep stack design. And I mean, it's now been on the market. This is going to be the 4th year that it's on the market, and the sales of it just speaks for itself. Like, it's consistently selling out when it comes in. I've had plenty of older bodybuilders who would have been like myself that would have struggled through insomnia in the later stages of prep, saying that it's completely changed how they view prep. They're getting, sometimes, okay, they're not getting enough total sleep, but what sleep they do get, the 5 or 6 hours, is quality sleep that they're well able to function the next day. So from there,
I'm gonna stop you. Like, you don't recommend taking melatonin?
So melatonin, if you do work shift, it is important that you do supplement with some level of melatonin if you work night shifts, because some of the practices you should incorporate when you work shift are obviously stuff that's going to offset your circadian release of melatonin so you don't fall asleep at night time. And as you can probably see, it's quite bright here, and you can see it in my glasses. I have a daylight lamp on here in the office. I have no windows in this office because it's a little alcove in our roof. So the daylight lamp mimics sunlight coming in through the window, so it's going to help wake up my body in the morning time. But you can do the same thing, obviously, at nighttime if you're working night shift, is having one of these lamps at your desk where you're being exposed to daylight at nighttime, and it's basically telling your circadian rhythm, don't secrete melatonin. So in that regard, if you're doing practices on night shift that disturb how your body makes melatonin, then you definitely need to supplement with it, because it's not just a hormone that brings on sleep. It's a very powerful antioxidant for cellular health as well. And that's where it plays a critical role in our health. The sleep onset is just sort of a bonus, in my opinion, of melatonin's effects. So rather than viewing melatonin as a sleep aid for someone who works shifts, they should actually be viewing it as an antioxidant similar to vitamin E, vitamin C, glutathione, any of these things where we know melatonin plays a critical role in cleaning up free radicals in the body. So it is a very useful supplement, but it's not one that, you can, I guess, utilize as a sleep aid because of the half-life as well. Anyway, you'll get 3 hours sleep and then you're wide awake. And that's sort of where guys then start to realize the beauty of the sleep stack versus trying to survive a prep using, barbiturates or diazepines, or, going the route of taking high doses of melatonin to try and keep you asleep. And that was sort of like, my first sort of step of getting people to understand root causes towards problems. And then I sort of moved into the CV stack, the kidney and blood pressure stack, which we called Ashtrag Flow, and then obviously the liver stack. I wanted people within the bodybuilding community to realize that the health negatives that come from PED use can be offset if we intelligently think about what's happening in the body. And the CV stack is a prime example in that it helps increase HDL production in the liver, or helps provide substrates that can increase HDL production, or help maintain the HDL that you're producing now currently. Because if you think about what I said before about hepatic lipase, it can be sort of an uphill battle where you're not really going to increase your HDL if the androgens are making more of this enzyme that breaks it down. So the CV stack's first couple of ingredients like citrus bergamot and pantotene play into how our liver responds and creates HDL molecules. But the more important aspect to the CV stack is to offset LDL oxidation. So when we sort of view Western society's view of cardiovascular disease, it's sort of, you have high LDL and that's bad. And if you don't have high HDL, that's bad as well. But we need to view that really what's the purpose of these molecules? Let's actually think logically from a physiological perspective. What do HDL and LDL actually do in the body? And it becomes LDL transports fats away from the liver, and HDL transports fats back to the liver so you can excrete them. And that's all they are. They're like two little buses running two separate bus routes. But the devil then becomes what happens on their journeys, basically. So if you have LDL molecules that are then getting oxidized by free radicals in your bloodstream, those LDL particles then become oxidized or rancid. And basically they become an opportunity for, I guess, disease to progress, because your immune system now views that LDL particle as dysfunctional. And ultimately then what happens is these LDL particles that are oxidized get consumed by your macrophages, which is your white blood cells. So they're like little Pac-Men. And they come along and they see the oxidized LDL and just grab it and form a molecule, or form a I guess, complex with it to form what we know as foam cells. And these foam cells are actually trying to protect your body from that oxidized LDL. But in doing that, the foam cells then sort of aggregate into what we term plaque, into a deposit inside the endothelium, which is the smooth muscle lining of your artery, and form basically a scab, is what it'd be like. It'd be like if you got a cut and your white blood cells, platelets came and form a scab. You form a scab inside the artery. Now that scab over time will accumulate more and more foam cells as more and more oxidized LDL comes in. And eventually what sort of happens is inside your artery, that scab is pushing on the inside of the wall, and then it just ruptures. And out comes this big glob of foam cells, calcium ions, all sort of things that have gotten caught into that plaque deposits in your within your artery. And you basically, your immune system, more so your platelets, go, what's that? And decide to clump it all together into a clot. And that clot all ultimately goes to your brain or goes to your heart, and you have a heart attack or you have a stroke. So what we need to view there then is, yes, we need to control how much LDL we're making, because as an artifact, if you have high LDL, you've probably got a high probability of oxidized LDL. And if you've low HDL, then you've high likelihood that there's more triglycerides getting deposited into the bloodstream and not being recycled out of the body. So if we can offset how that LDL gets oxidized, it won't really matter how high your LDL goes, because it's never causing the disease process. So the ingredients then that I put in the CV stack were really high forms of antioxidants. So you had the likes of vitamin E in the form of a complex that has both tocotrienols and tocopherols. And people never realize that when you take a vitamin E supplement, it's important that you're actually getting the 8 isoforms of vitamin E. And normally a lot of supplements are either alpha or gamma tocopherol. Okay, that gives some benefit, but it's not really the bigger picture when your body actually utilizes tocotrienols as the real, I guess, electron donors. So we have to view then that using the correct vitamin E is important. And then the rest of the ingredient panel is the likes of grapeseed extract, ECGC from green tea, allicin from odorless garlic, all these sort of known things, olive leaf extract, that are really high in natural polyphenols and antioxidants, that is going to offset when we have free radical exposure, either from the foods we ingest or the air that we breathe from our environment, that we're offsetting those free radicals and stopping them from attacking our LDL molecules. And it's getting people in that mindset of, yes, we've had years of indoctrination towards, if you have high LDL, here's a statin. That's sort of the conventional approach. Take the statin, we'll lower LDL synthesis, we'll block it off. You can't develop heart disease because you've now suppressed your LDL. When that's not really correct, because you can still develop heart disease when you take statins because of that oxidized LDL conundrum. So even though you're making less LDL, if your environment is dictating that it gets oxidized, it's still going to cause the disease. And it's this argument that we need to start getting people to understand, that how we treat disease in today's society is really flawed. And that if we take the steps where we ensure our nutrition is covered, so we're not ingesting, I guess, sources, for example, polyunsaturated fats have a high likelihood of being oxidized in the body. So again, that contributes to free radical production. If we have dysfunctional mitochondria, where we're not actually I guess when mitochondria feed into the electron transport chain and creating energy in our body, they create free radicals, which our body then uses glutathione to clean up. So if you don't have enough glutathione in your body, and while your mitochondria are doing their work, you're feeding into this free radical issue. So again, that feeds all then into cardiovascular disease. So it becomes important that we start really getting people to think of the global picture rather than a distinct disease model. And of course, then the I guess familial risk of having high LDL does have a role in certain people requiring statins, but it really comes down to what's going into your body, what's the nutrition you're providing, what's your environment doing to your body, and then correcting those issues. And like I said before we come on, it does come down to a level of, in any aspect towards immune health, cellular health, if you use PEDs, it's your own personal responsibility to have your health corrected effectively rather than relying on other medications that are just really masking symptoms rather than correcting the root cause.
Yeah, exactly. And like here, they prescribe statins even for people that don't use any gear and they just don't have their diet right. You know, like people come to the ambulance and they're like, they tell them, oh, you have high LDL, and they're like, okay, so I have to fix diet, start eating clean, and they're like, no, we'll prescribe this statin and you're fine. They don't
Yeah,
even give them the motivation to change up their diet. You know, it's
that's
silly.
exactly it. And it's sort of, I read it once before. Our society is sort of like a pill for an ill. So basically, no matter what sort of symptom or illness you're suffering with, we have a medication that will get rid of that symptom. And it's okay. I get that in conventional medicine, in modern day, doctors don't have the time, especially GPs, to sit with people and coach them for 30 minutes on, oh, you should be doing this with your diet. And I guess maybe at some point it sort of started to fall on either deaf ears, where people are just adamant, give me the drug and I'm just going to live my life the way I want to, or there's a lack of education in that sector of medicine that we're sort of stuck in our old ways of viewing heart disease rather than actually figuring out that, you know what, if I spent the time with my patient here to actually correct their nutrition. And again, doctors aren't nutritionists, so that's another fundamental flaw that a lot of the I guess recent doctors that are starting to graduate are paying attention and doing nutrition courses because they start to understand that the value of nutrition playing into cardiovascular disease, thyroid health, fatty liver disease, all these disease processes coming straight back to what that person is putting into their body. It's not that their body has become dysfunctional for no reason. It's that they've ultimately brought that on themselves with the decisions they've made. So I guess there's two ways that we have to view it. Either we start to increase education towards nutrition within the medical community, and we also try and give time to allow that, I guess, education to be delivered to patients as well. But again, comes back to personal responsibility, and is that person going to take on board the decisions that you've made with them in order for them to correct that underlying health problem. And in a lot of cases it sort of falls on deaf ears, where people aren't willing to give up, for example, eating multiple takeaways per week, or eating fast food, or you can't tell me what I'm going to do with my life. We're sort of stuck in this spiral society where change has to come from probably an early age, where we educate younger people on the decisions they make in life, when your brain is probably more plastic and accepting to ideas rather than your stubbornness in your 20s and 30s.
But it's like really hard, because not only like people don't want to learn the better way, but I think it's also censored. Like even me, when I cured the arthritis and was at my doctor and telling her that like I gradually lowered the doses of medication and that I finally don't need to that I can finally stop taking it. and I started telling her about the diet, about the supplements, the protocols, and like if she doesn't want the protocols to help the other people as well, no, it's okay, fine, it's good.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
they even censor the information, and like with this whole sea flu, we're gonna call it, due to censorship, it's like completely opposite of what might be true,
Yeah. And I mean, even like you said, with the current environment, that personal responsibility is never more true, in that we have people who are being forced to go down the the route of accepting the gibbety thing. And to me, as a scientist who's, studied drug development, it just does not make sense as a global strategy. And I said this last year in March when this started to appear, that basically, even if this gibbety thing appeared, and okay, drug development overall takes about 10 to 15 years from research and development up to phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. It's about 15 years. The fastest drug ever took 5 years, and that was an anti-cancer medication. The FDA fast-tracked that in 5 years. So the FDA has 5 clear routes of how they can give exemptions, basically. And in each scenario, it's pretty much that, is there really a medical need for this compound for us to skip some of the safety review steps? And as we see in a lot of certain things on the market now, have received emergency use exemption. So basically, we've allowed it onto the market, and we will monitor safety as it's being used, which to me is crazy, because we don't have long-term safety data even over a 3-year period before this is implemented to the whole population. So with that in mind, basically the flaws there anyway come back to how people have been educated on how these medicines work. And basically, when you're trying to explain to people that these certain medicines will reduce symptoms but don't stop transmission, and still make you or allow you to catch a disease, they're not an effective strategy to stop spread or transmission. They will reduce symptoms and potentially mortality if those symptoms were to lead to death. But it doesn't do the overall job of what people are being falsely led to believe, and that's to stop transmission. That if you take this certain thing, that it's going to stop you from spreading the disease. And that's not the case. You'll still be able to contract the virus. You'll still be able to, I guess, replicate it to a certain threshold. It may not be to the same load as a normal symptomatic person, but you'll still obviously be able to, for a period of time, spread these particles, whether it's onto surfaces or your environment around you. It doesn't necessarily have to be to a person. You can still technically transmit this. And then it comes back to what I've been saying from the beginning, and that's your personal responsibility to take care of your immune system. Understand that the immune system that we have, the innate and the adaptive immune system, have, I guess, evolved over thousands of years. And we've developed in synergy with bacteria and viruses. And that we ultimately, that symbiotic relationship is probably what makes us survive day to day, is that we have bacteria in our gut that break down certain things within our food to provide substrates that we utilize for energy. So the likes of butyrates from bacteria within our gut. And that symbiotic relationship keeps them happy, keeps us happy, and that's how we survive society. But if we live, obviously, a life where we're not paying attention to the nutrition, like I said at the start, our antioxidant status is low, so we have low glutathione. Your immune system heavily relies on glutathione as a signaling molecule, but also as an antioxidant in response to infection. So that cytokine storm that people were scared about last year, where people's insides were just getting melted, is an artifact of having low antioxidant status in the body. So the immune system becomes dysfunctional, and it's basically like sending in, I guess, a fleet of helicopter Apaches to bomb a village to kill one person. So your body basically produces all these cytokines to try and kill off this pathogen, but does it in a dysfunctional way because it doesn't actually know how to target correctly that pathogen. If you had correct nutrition and obviously correct antioxidant status, and all that sort of stuff that plays into cellular immune health, then your likelihood of mounting an inefficient immune response becomes low. Your survival outcome becomes higher, and obviously your symptoms in that regard become lower as well. So it really shocks me that, like, last year we had papers coming out to try and disprove that vitamin C could be an effective supplement for this situation, when we know that vitamin C acts as a donor to replenish vitamin E in our body. So vitamin C doesn't have really any critical role in being this critical antioxidant in itself. It helps to replenish or give electrons back to vitamin E to allow vitamin E to do the work as an antioxidant. But we have all these like suppression or censorship of published work that's actually, showing these are critical things we should be implementing. I mean, I even done a post on vitamin D, I think 2 months ago on Instagram, showing how vitamin D is not just an efficient strategy of the current situation, but for just daily life, that we should be striving for adequate vitamin D levels, and that they should be closely corrected for the environment that you live in. And it's so cheap. It's about 10p per day to implement a dose of vitamin D that's sufficient to keep you in this wellness range that we know is important for cellular signaling. And yet we had papers coming out where people were correlating high vitamin D levels to worse outcomes with this C word. And that when you looked at the population that you're actually applying the study to, it was people who are on average between 60 and 80. They had Alzheimer's and they had high blood pressure. And they have all these underlying disease processes where, okay, yes, giving them high vitamin D might not actually play any huge role considering the other underlying pathologies that they have. And this is where this bias in science and science publication has just ruined scientific credibility in the last year and a half. Now, that bias has always existed in science, and that you can basically prove anything that you want to with a study. If you have the right motivation, the right understanding of statistics, you can manipulate your question in statistics to give you the favorable probability value, the p-value. And that's another thing that people don't really pay attention to is study design, and obviously study bias and who's funding the study. Because ultimately, if someone's paying me £1 million to prove a question, I'm not going to turn around to them after years' work and go, well, actually, we found the reverse of what you've paid me to study, basically. Your study funding is your person who's actually giving you the funding isn't going to be too happy. You turn around and going, well, actually, I've proven that it's the opposite of what you're telling me to try and prove. So your job there is basically to go back and look at the data and try and find some way to manipulate how the statistical question's been asked to give a more favorable outcome. And that's where it becomes critically important, I guess, to look at how the question's put forward. And I mean, yesterday on my story, or at the weekend on my story, we know right now in the UK, there's 920 reports of miscarriage. Now, if you apply that to the total population who've received the GBD, it sort of comes down to then a 1 in 100,000 risk. Now, the total people who've received it is males, females, and older generation. So everyone's included in that risk analysis of 1 in 100,000. So if you looked at that and you went, I have a 1 in 100,000 risk of miscarriage if I receive this, you think, okay, 1 in 100,000 is is pretty good odds, like of not having I guess, a unsuccessful outcome. But then if you actually then critically think that's the whole population, it's going to be non-pregnant people. So how many pregnant people are actually in that subset of total received? Now, I couldn't find it specifically for the UK, but I could find it for the US. And the US number was something like 5,600 people had received it and were pregnant. Now, if you apply 920 miscarriages to probably a subset similar, now bear in mind the US population is even bigger than the UK's. So 5,600 could even be smaller in terms of the UK sample size. The risk became nearly 1 in 5. And it's sort of like, if I wanted to skew the public's opinion on this question, I'd say, 1 in 100,000 of total population received. But if I actually went, okay, how many of them were pregnant and received it, and apply the same sort of numbers to that, it then becomes a 1 in 5 risk. You're pretty sure you tell someone you've got a 20% chance of having miscarriage on top of already the sort of 1 in 10 chance of miscarriage that naturally happens. People would start thinking this isn't such a good idea to be doing in that certain population. And that's the flaws of, obviously, the scientific question is very detailed towards what is the hypothesis? What is that question specifically asking? And how am I arriving at that conclusion? And it's become so diluted with guys being able to change the way we analyze that data for favorable outcomes that it really takes now being very critical in your mind of, is what's being said here really true? Because you have people that are just peer reviewing and publishing for the sake of it, whereby the people who are peer reviewing may not actually be paying attention to everything critically that's going on underlying with the study. So it's scary how society has progressed over the last 15 months in terms of science is almost a cult or a religion, and we have like biased views on science, and really science shouldn't be biased at all. Science should be either black or white. There can be, I guess, some nuances within the black and white nature of it, but it should really be straightforward. What's the problem? And here's a straightforward answer, rather than manipulating the problem to give you your answer.
Yeah, right. It's like everything's manipulated. Like even the deaths here in Slovakia, it's like if someone dies over 65 years old, he's counted as 4 people. This is the craziest stuff I've ever seen. And it's like, it's officially in like the law. So people actually have access to it and can go on a website and really check it. It's not like someone would say it, and people, even though you can find it original on the government site, people say it's fake. Like they must have made some, it must have been like writing, like someone write a bad number or stuff. Like they are so stupid here. It's like crazy.
And we had the same. I mean, the Central Statistics Office of Ireland will be publishing last year's complete full Q1 to Q4 death data within the next month. And the deaths last year were pretty much, on average, maybe even slightly lower than the previous 4 years. Now, to me, like I said to you before, if this is like a real pandemic, we'd see people falling on the streets, dying, and like to me, it's just completely blown out of proportion. Yes, there are people who suffer ill consequences of this disease, but again, it comes back to, you even have mainstream media censoring that, they publish pictures of certain individuals in hospital who have suffered with the consequences, and said, this previously healthy individual, and not to be, I guess, not to be making any sort of discrimination, but the person's picture, you can clearly see that the person is carrying excessive weight and excessive adipose without giving them a term. And with that, we know a dysfunctional immune system response is mounted, because adipocytes, the cells that make fats that store fats in your body, make cytokines. They make inflammatory molecules. So if you have an excess of adipocytes or adipose tissue within your body, your immune system is going to be dysfunctional anyway. And again, it goes back to, we have published data on those GBD things in obese individuals where the effectiveness is about 40%. And that's because of the resistance of their immune system because of the dysfunction caused by the elevated adipose. But again, if you were to even, like, if I change the tone of what I'm saying, if you even go and fat shame someone and saying, you're clinically obese, your immune system is dysfunctional because of the choices you've made, regardless of whether there's some underlying genetic issue in hepatic clearance of triglycerides, because yes, there's certain people who might have genetic issues where they would store weight or thyroid metabolic issues. But even in that sense, even if you have those underlying genetic issues, it's still your responsibility to dictate how your body has stored adipose tissue or stored triglycerides. Regardless of what way you want to plug your head in the sand and go, well, it's my life, I'm going to do what I want. This sort of flip-flop opinion of forcing people down the route of mandatory GBDs, and then, taking the other approach and going, well, I do everything to protect my cellular health. I exercise regularly. I eat a very high antioxidant diet. I take supplements for my immune system. I practice good hygiene. I have low levels of body fat. I have a good waist to hip ratio, all these sort of things that we use for predictive metabolic health. Why should I be forced to do something when you're not willing to be arsed, basically, what we'd say in Ireland, to pay attention to your nutrition and your supplementation and to take that personal responsibility of your cellular health first? So it again, it's just coming back to the same whole thing of personal responsibility to health and acknowledging that responsibility.
Yeah, but like what pisses me off is, like, sometimes the doctors, even when you're doing good stuff, they tell you how, like, it's bad. Like, I've been at my doctor and she's asking me if I feel good and what vitamins I take, and I just went over the list and I said vitamin D3, and she was like, how much do you take? And I'm like, from 5,000 to 10,000 units. Like, it's a pro hormone, like it isn't the actual hormone, and I got blood tests regularly. And she's like, the RDA is 200 units. And I'm like, okay, 200 units, but that's nothing. It's literally nothing. And she immediately sent me to have a blood work because I'm overdosed, and she even wanted to put me in the hospital because I'm overdosed with vitamin D. And I take blood work regularly, like every month, and my vitamin D levels are fine, And I'm telling that, and she, even though wants to send me to the hospital.
I mean, even a classic scenario, and this is probably, I don't know what it's probably like in Slovakia, but in Ireland, even if you say to your GP, or I know of guys, obviously through health consults, they've gone to their GP and the GP's going through their history and their blood work, and then they say, oh, I'm taking whey protein. Like, oh, that protein's going to destroy your kidneys. this sort of really archaic.
Or creatine.
Or creatine. Yeah, creatine's a steroid, and all this sort of stuff that I gave a talk on the pharmacology of anabolic steroids and their health implications at the UK Body Power Expo in 2019. And there was several GPs in the audience during the talk, and they actually submitted my talk as a form of CPD, of professional development. And afterwards, a lot of their questions to me were, this is sort of stuff that we're never even thought of, like even from an academic level, that we're sort of viewing that these compounds are taboo and that, they're very dangerous. Well, ultimately, how I put it forward at like the beginning of the talk is anabolic androgenic steroids were a medicine at one point. We implemented these as medicinal compounds, and then some fool decided to implement it into athletic performance strategies. But we designed these to treat diseases. We didn't design these for guys to run sub 10-second 100-meter sprints. We ultimately designed these for burn victims, for people who are suffering with, I guess, sarcopenia in old age, HIV, where we see muscle wasting starting to happen, all these disease processes where we want to take advantage of that anabolic pathway of ensuring that androgenic signaling is making more muscle protein, or we're stopping that muscle protein breakdown through that glucocorticoid inhibition. So they start to really then, see that, okay, we've a lot of work here within the medical field and general practice to become upscaled in this area. Now, on the other side of it, I'd say on average, most GPs will probably only see probably less than 10 steroid users over their career, basically, because of how afraid people are to approach GPs on this subject. For one, the medical stigma, but also too, the lack of knowledge. And that sort of comes back to then how I applied the root cause mentality of PCT, post-cycle therapy, and viewing that the post-cycle therapy that sort of was mainstream with the likes of the Power PCT protocol was a fantastic protocol, but at some point Chinese whispers had changed how the actual protocol was supposed to be done, and that implementing a PCT strategy when there's still drugs in your system, which is what the current or old way used to view it, isn't really correct, because your system's still going to be suppressed. So how can you restart your natural system if the compounds that cause the suppression are still present? And that's where I start to say, right, guys, let's really put on our pharmacology hats here and think, let the drugs clear out first, assess where your body is. Has your body done what it's designed to do, and it's make its own testosterone when there's no testosterone present? If that doesn't occur and your brain doesn't start to signal and make these fertility hormones, that's when we put in the PCT. Because again, the PCT is designed as a pharmaceutical aid to speed up the process that would occur naturally. So effectively, we're trying to, I guess, get to the root cause of what's the problem with correct PCT to get the HPTA up and running again. And that again is an area where guys suffer. They come off, they run high doses, they run very androgenic or harsh compounds. And then when they come off, they suffer mental side effects. And no one is actually sitting down and coaching guys that this is actually expected. That when you take super physiological levels of testosterone or even any other type of androgen, it interacts with how your brain signals dopamine and how your brain creates serotonin. So how those neurotransmitters are transported in the brain are affected. And due to that, you'll have an increase in dopamine synthesis when you have higher testosterone levels. So that's why you feel amazing when you're taking testosterone and you have all this natural drive for life. But when you come off, your brain is so used to having that high level of dopamine or dopamine transport that the neurons in your brain, even though they're receiving normal amounts of dopamine now, and what I mean by normal is what you would have made previously to being on steroids, it's just not enough for your brain. And that's where you see the libido issues, where you see the depressive nature of post-use. And again, that comes back to the lack of education. If you're going down this route of PCT to come off fully after being on for quite some time, it can take months for that neurochemistry to balance out. So you can't just expect going from this massive high of being on, having a massive sex drive and libido, to then coming off, and then within a space of maybe 2 or 3 months be back to how you were before you took anything, because your brain just does not operate that way. And this same sort of scenario, your environment is going to dictate your brain's, I guess, seeking of dopamine. And we have everything in society towards, social media that's feeding into that dopamine drive of making you feel good. You have people that, readily accessible, like I say to guys, even pornography. All these things play into how your brain's signaling dopamine, where you're looking for this seeking reward or pleasure. And if you're constantly engaged in those activities, of course, you're going to find an issue where your brain isn't actually able to hit that sensitivity level of dopamine that's required to make you feel stimulated. And that's where that lack of libido comes in post steroid use. But, you know, if you went to your GP after taking steroids and you're suffering with low libido or, you know, erectile dysfunction, guarantee the first two things you're given is either a PD5 inhibitor, so Cialis or Viagra, and told, there you go, take that for your erectile dysfunction. And then probably try it on an antidepressant. Try it on something that's like a selective dopamine receptor reuptake inhibitor. So you then have this issue where we're trying to keep that dopamine in the brain. That might bring some relief, but it's not actually correct. And again, that neurochemistry from putting in the antidepressant gets completely skewed again. So we have this complete lack of understanding of how these compounds actually work, how we get to that root cause. And, you know, this common theme that I then have with consults with guys who have done PCT and suffer these consequences, when you sit down and talk them through this neurochemical imbalance and actually explain everything to them, unfortunately, the sort of solution is patience and avoiding activities that drive dopamine high. But it gives them some relief and hope that, okay, if I remain diligent, I sort of try and keep that dopamine stimulation as low as I can, my brain will resolve itself and I will be back to where I was before I took any androgenic steroids. But it's sort of getting them to understand that mechanism and that root cause that will stop them from going down the route of, I guess, getting prescribed pharmaceuticals to offset some of those symptoms.
Yeah, like this is amazing. Like nobody addressed it like this before. Amazing knowledge. And one thing I wanted to ask you, my friend, he has a really good doctor in Prague, and he said to him, like, if you would be taking testosterone, only testosterone, not any testosterone derivatives, that if you would take it for 20, 30 years, after taking it out, you would still have natural testosterone production. He told that hypogonadism is caused by the DHT and stuff. It's not caused primarily by testosterone. What do you think about that? Because sometimes I think it's not true.
I'd remain reserved to what's being hypothesized there, but I will say that hypogonadism, so both primary and secondary hypogonadism, have many different pathways that can feed into that disease, basically. So to make it simple for people that are listening, primary hypogonadism would be your testicles no longer make testosterone. So there's something wrong with the Leydig cells in your testicles that no longer function correctly and produce testosterone from DHEA and pregnenolone. And then you have secondary hypogonadism, whereby your testicles do make testosterone. So the Leydig cells are functional, but something has gone wrong with either the hypothalamus. So the neurons in the hypothalamus receive signals from your body producing testosterone and estrogen to create gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that goes to your pituitary, and the pituitary makes FSH and LH, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And that luteinizing hormone is what acts on the Leydig cells to make testosterone. So when you take testosterone itself, the oxidative stress that's caused by testosterone alone versus some of the other synthetic androgens is probably lower. Not that we have any real conclusive studies to prove it, but because it's a bioidentical hormone, so when we take testosterone only, it's what your body makes naturally anyway. And what we'd sort of expect to see is in guys who have, natural levels that are way outside the physiological. So if you have guys who do naturally have testosterone in the 35 and 40 nanomolar region, we'd expect to see these issues arise in terms of, I guess, the functional hypogonadism happening. Now, when we implement the synthetic steroids, we do know the likes of nandrolone, trenbolone, and some of the oral steroids do induce oxidative stress. So in other words, what happens there is the morphology of your Leydig cells in your testicles changes. So those Leydig cells become damaged and dysfunctional. So as an artifact of that, then, like what we see with the atrophy of the testicles, the cells inside the testicles actually get damaged. And that's how primary hypogonadism tends to develop, is that we've had oxidative stress at the testicles. Again, it comes back to this whole free radicals and antioxidant status of your body, being able to protect those cells from that damage. That's sort of where you're going to see then irreversible hypogonadism, in that the Leydig cells are now ruined. You're not going to make testosterone. You're going to need TRT. The other side, the secondary hypogonadism, is probably a little more complex, because the hypothalamic neurons can get damaged. So in other words, the signaling from the testicle back to the hypothalamus gets damaged, and you no longer make sufficient amounts of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So as an artifact, your LH and FSH are going to be lower. Or we can have actual direct damage to the actual pituitary itself, and the pituitary is no longer receiving that stimulation to produce LH and FSH in the correct amounts. Or you may actually have a scenario where the pituitary is actually making too much LH and FSH, and you end up with a scenario where eventually you have pituitary issues where it's trying to compensate for the testicles to make more testosterone, and eventually the pituitary burns out. So if you're just using testosterone only in, I guess, a super physiological dose over 20 to 30 years, the risk of irreversible hypogonadism, I couldn't say conclusively like he is that you'd be able to turn back on the HPTA axis. But I will say I have seen guys who have followed through with the PCT protocol that I've made public for people to follow, that I've seen several professionals who have been on for at least 10 to 15 years and finally decide, you know what, I'm in my 40s. I don't want to go down this route of TRT. I want to see, can I get my HPTA back working again naturally? They've recovered. But again, we have to view that these are guys who have been so meticulous with their nutrition for years, with their health supplementation. So the likelihood of any sort of damage occurring within the Leydig cells was probably lower than your average person. And I guess just by pure coincidence or pure luck that nothing has actually happened to the hypothalamic neurons or the pituitary. But I always say to guys, like, if you've been on for a considerable length of time, you can't correlate this back to successful recovery. I never want to give anyone that chance of hope of thinking, okay, I've been on 10 years, I'll be able to come off gear for the rest of my life, because that's not really how it works. There's so many nuances, like I said there, that you end up with having to consider, you know, have I damaged my testicles? Have I damaged the neurons in my brain? Have I damaged the pituitary? And you don't actually know that answer until you actually try and attempt a PCT and look at what's happening in blood work. Of course, you know, before you come off, you could go and get an ultrasound on your testicles to see what are the cells like within the testicle. Have they completely atrophied? Have they changed their morphology? And in that case, you could probably predict to someone, okay, you're going to have primary hypogonadic issues when you come off TRT, so you're better off staying on TRT for your life. But without something like that, it is always a complete gamble, always. And I don't want anyone ever even to think using HCG on cycle just because it maintains Leydig cell size doesn't necessarily mean that the Leydig cells aren't being damaged either. So I've always said this, like in the past, that even testicle size is not a correlation towards recovery. What signals recovery is your blood work being in range and producing natural testosterone, LH and FSH. So I don't buy into this sort of, you know, oh, well, I've been able to keep my testicles the same size on cycle as when I was off. Yes, you're stimulating those Leydig cells to stay volumized, because that's what LH does in our body as an artifact of its function. But that doesn't necessarily mean, like I said, that those cells haven't become dysfunctional or changed their shape or changed how they produce testosterone when you cease any use of testosterone.
Yeah, amazing explanation. Like, this is amazing. Like, you always ask some question and you just give the whole story of it. It's amazing.
And that's like, again, I've spent time, like, from a personal aspect, trying to view all these things, because it comes back to just the frustration seeing on, when I was on the JP forum, guys doing PCTs, or what they thought were correct PCTs, and then putting blood work on the forum after like 15 weeks, and they're still suppressed. And it's sort of like they used equipoise, which stays in your system for at least 9 to 10 weeks. So it doesn't matter you start PCT after 2 weeks. You're only probably just starting to recover from the equipoise clearing after a 15-week PCT. And guys suffering with fertility issues because of they don't actually understand how to get that HPTA cooperating to produce sperm. So it just all came back to figuring out, again, how can we explain simply these problems to people so that they can take action effectively. And again, ultimately, it's just, I want guys to not have any sort of serious consequences from some of the choices they make. And that's why I've over the years made so much like free. I've never gone the route of being this sort of like hidden guru which has all the answers. It's been like, here's everything on Instagram pretty much to what I can share with you for free. Of course, you know, I have a consult service if people want to sit and have a chat like what we're doing here on the podcast. That is available where I'll review everything with people. But I wanted to give people some knowledge that they could go away and effectively, I guess, treat some of the issues that they may be left with. And PCT was a big one. And like, I used to laugh in the beginning because people would send me like screenshots from forums, and they'd be like, oh, they're talking about you on this forum and they're saying like what you've said about PCT is completely wrong. And it's sort of like, my response to them was, well, considering that I'm giving it to them for free, I've never said not to do it, or, you know, my way is completely correct. But I basically said, here's an idea. You want to follow it. It's all there for you to use. I've never went, oh, you know what? Here's like the start of it. And if you want the rest of it, buy my ebook, or I'll sell you the protocol for €50. It's like, the protocol is there to follow. If you want, and you want me to sit down like we're doing here and I can talk you through the PCT, yes, we can have a consult, but it's all there. Like, underneath the flaws in modern PCT YouTube video, I have the complete protocol pretty much, and you just have to take that information and apply it to your own scenario. And you know, whether you want to do that or not, or you want to follow what's being put on most of the forums, that's fine. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out for you and you do an incorrectly timed PCT, you're going to spend months suffering with mental health issues that could have been avoided by actually being intelligent when it came to the PCT. So I guess I'm just sort of in this now for how many more people can I help, just to make sure people have good quality of life when they're done with bodybuilding.
Yeah, I know this crazy guy from the gym. He's like, he took testosterone and trenbolone, and then always he said like, PCT is expensive, fuck PCT, it's all in your head, you can start testosterone with your head. And he came into the gym, he was like deadlifting like 10th of the weight he used to, and he was like, fuck it, I'm going back to test and tren.
Yeah, and but that's again one of the issues, like what we touched on earlier with the libido side of things after a PCT. And this is where the, I guess, addictive nature of anabolic steroids becomes a sort of mental as well as physical addiction. So really, when we view how our body uses these compounds, it's not really the same physical addiction as, say, an opioid, in that we have physical withdrawals that our body actively fights against. With AAS, when you stop and you do your PCT and you come off, obviously that dopamine signaling, like I said, is so basically your neurons are up here and your brain is only making this much. So you're sort of waiting for your neurons to fall back. The threshold, the voltage, like, this is where it comes back to really detailed your neurons have a voltage basically applied, and that's how the neurotransmitters go across the neuron. You're waiting for that voltage basically to fall back to where it was originally. In that scenario, you have guys who have no libido after doing their PCT. Yes, they've recovered. Their blood work says their test level says 20. They're making LH, they're making FSH, but their life is a misery. They have no libido, no drive. They have like pretty much like androgen resistance, where their body isn't effectively using the testosterone. But that's not really the case, because, you know, the recovery, their strength, all these sort of things are still being ticked off when it comes to a physiological perspective. It's the psychological level that's been interfered with, and dealing with that psychology. And that's where guys then realize that, oh wait, when I was taking tests and I was on cycle, I had great libido and I had great strength and I had great drive. But now I'm off and I'm back to normal. Even though my blood work is saying it's all good, maybe if I went back on cycle, I'd feel better again. And it starts this vicious cycle of PCT coming off, feeling like crap, and then realizing, oh wait, if I just do even 1 mil of test, if I do 250 milligrams a week, or they start like conning themselves into all these like low doses, I'll be able to get my libido back and I'll feel amazing. And it's sort of then driving that psychological dependence, and that you associate feeling well with being on. But you then have this physical dependence on it, where you start to think, oh, I can't get an erection anymore. But when I'm on cycle, I can get erections. So if I go back and use these compounds, I'm going to correct that problem. And that's another vicious problem, where guys are just coming on and off all the time because of they're trying to correct that underlying psychology. And it's sort of similar to what happened with that guy in the gym, that he comes off, realizes that he sort of effed himself up. And then the only sort of solution in his mind is, oh, let's just go back on. And I guess if you're young, okay, you've probably a certain level of leeway there that, you know, you get away with that for a few years. When you start to get older, again, your lifestyle, all that sort of stuff we spoke about starts to play into then the equation of disease progressing. And then obviously you're sort of digging yourself an early grave by making that sort of decision.
Sure. And what do you think about SARMs? It's like everyone tells SARMs, benefits of steroids, no side effects.
So during my PhD, I was doing my PhD between 2008 and 2012. And basically, I gave a presentation on SARMs, because at that point, SARMs have been in development probably about 3 years. And we started research about 2005. And so I presented a review paper on these piperidine containing molecules. So basically, they were able to devise a class of molecules that would bind to the androgen receptor, specifically in muscle tissue. And that's what SARMs are ultimately designed to do. When we take steroids themselves, the target molecule is the androgen receptor, but we have androgen receptors everywhere in our body. Every cell in our body has an androgen receptor. So we need to then try and distinguish, how can we get specific androgen receptors targeted to yield a positive effect. So obviously the negative side effects from androgen use comes from potentially androgenic side effects. So in that case, we have androgen receptors in our hair, in our skin, in our sex organs, those kind being activated and causing, you know, maybe androgenic alopecia, increased sebum production, so you create more acne, sex organ enlargement, where females start to have enlarged clitoris. All these things are sort of the androgenic side effects that we may not potentially want. So with SARMs, then we go down the route of, let's target the androgen receptors specifically on myocytes on our muscle cells, and let's target them specifically so that we get all the positive effects of muscle cell androgen receptor gene transcription, which plays into then how your body creates more muscle protein, how we stop muscle protein breakdown, all these sort of signaling cascades that happen and the certain pathways that are involved, and basically limit these androgenic side effects. Now, the theory is fantastic, but it's very difficult for your body to specifically distinguish between an androgen receptor on your skin or an androgen receptor in your muscles. Even though I guess we have this specific compound structure that we feel fits to the isoform of the androgen receptor on muscle tissue. When we get to look at the clinical trials data, the results, specifically in the populations these were designed for, were elderly people, or again, going down the route of people with severe disease and muscle wasting. The results aren't really anything on par to, I guess, anabolic steroids that we've created in the past, like oxandrolone, anavar, or even oxymetolone, anadrol. And they sort of then fell to the wayside because pharmaceutical companies started to realize that this specific selective androgen receptor targeting in muscle tissue was a very difficult process for the body to do. And we could potentially get some of that effect, but we'd have to dose quite high. Now, the population who we did see some positive benefit to were the female population, which, again, the androgenic side effects in the female population are probably, I guess, more deleterious. So they actually cause more issues. So obviously females don't want to grow beards. They don't want to have square jaws. They don't want to have acne all over their body. Don't want hair falling out. They don't want, I guess, enlarged clitoris, all these sort of things that I've touched on. So SARMs in that regard might benefit females because if we use very low dosages within female population, that sort of selective androgen receptor modulation in muscle tissue may be just enough in order to see an improvement in strength in an elderly woman, whilst then obviously not having to worry about giving aromatizing compounds that might feed into estradiol in the body, and then obviously some of the other side effects that come from using some of the synthetic AAS. But it's sort of, a classic scenario of a fad taken off as a, I guess, fool's gold. You drag people in with this false premise of you're going to get all the benefits of steroids or any of the side effects, and it's not really true. And it's sort of a reason why pharmaceutical companies have abandoned, okay, we have the likes of Ostarine and S4 Andarine that have gone through stages of clinical trials for elderly people, but there's a reason why they've never been made officially licensed, and that's still because we still have safety concerns and efficacy concerns. When we have a class of anabolic synthetic steroids, which we have at least 60 years of safety data and dosage data on, that yes, have some level of side effect, but we can in certain instances control that variable. So it's a very good idea, but I think it's just a little ambitious in terms of, unless we can fully appreciate what is the distinct isoform of that androgen receptor on our muscle tissue that we can specifically target that binding pocket, it's going to be very difficult. And most people, this is getting quite complicated, but you have a gene obviously that is related to the androgen receptor, and within that gene, within how the gene is transcribed and then translated into the actual receptor, we have different components to that receptor itself. And the main part of the gene we're interested in here is the ligand binding domain. So that ligand binding domain is the actual part inside the receptor where your testosterone molecule comes in and binds into the receptor. And then obviously then they sort of combine together and go inside the cell, into your nucleus, and tell the nucleus with what we have response elements, and tell the nucleus, turn on this gene. And in that case, then we want to target the ligand binding domain of androgen receptors on our muscle cells and ensure that the nucleus response is the translation of a protein that is going to result in increased, I guess, either nervous system activation. So we're going to have a transfer over to increased strength or resiliency, or over to muscle protein synthesis through mTOR, or stopping muscle protein breakdown by acting on suppressing genes that produce glucocorticoids. So it's a really complex model, which is a great idea, but I don't think the molecules that we've done the structure activity relationships on are actually fully correct yet to target that isoform of the receptor.
Sure, I thought the same thing actually. Like, it's good on paper, but in reality, it's far away.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love if we had these compounds that had no side effects, no like. So obviously, we want certain level of androgenic side effects with certain compounds, because obviously, when we create DHT is what actually primes our nervous system to handle heavier loads. So DHT is important in that regard, that it's what allows your body to adapt to a heavier load when we're training. And then obviously then the anabolic side is more being driven by testosterone. So we still want to have a certain level of androgenicity in the background, but being able to utilize this artifact of just pure either muscle protein synthesis, muscle protein catabolism being halted, or, ultimately, like I said, getting the nervous system switched on. That would be fantastic if we were able to modify these current molecules to get to that point. But with how pharmaceutical industry research or research topics are going, you do have to realize then, like I said, we have classes of molecules that we already understand from a lot of structural activity relationship data on how these anabolic steroids work. So then it sort of becomes a what gain or what benefit does a pharmaceutical company have to going down the line of further research in this field of compounds? Because again, we have to think in terms of, it's not for the global population's benefit when we think of pharmaceutical industry. It's what's my return on investment? Because again, it's a business. So if you know that your population subset that's going to benefit from this compound is much smaller versus, say, diabetes or oncology for anti-cancer, well, then why am I going to pump millions into research and development? Yes, it's a cool concept. And yes, great for athletes, great for that sort of part of society. But where am I actually going to gain benefit over, say, for example, prescribing primobolan or anavar to a diseased patient? And pharmaceutical companies have to think in terms of, it's going to take me, like I said, about 15 years to get from R&D up to clinical trials. And even then, the money that's been pumped into ostarine and andarine, we're talking, 2002, 2003, the discovery of these classes of molecules. We're now nearly 18 years since that first report. So it's like, where's their return on investment yet when they're not even on the market? During clinical trials, yes, they're gathering data, but they're not actually, all the money that's been pumped into SARMs has actually yielded nothing really for these pharmaceutical companies. It's yielded a lot for underground peptide and underground research chemical companies who have then taken the design of these molecules, the patents of these molecules, and synthesized them themselves and sold on the black market. It really, if you're in the driving seat of a pharmaceutical company, you're really looking at ultimately what's your return on investment. So it's an area that, yes, has some promise, but I don't see it ever being anything significant, even in terms of the physique enhancement world.
Talking about the pharmaceutical companies and business, why do you think FDA blocked the precursor of glutathione N-acetylcysteine for like over the counter? It's over the prescription now.
Yeah. So the FDA, this isn't anything new with the FDA. So the FDA have been trying to subcategorize a whole list of supplements. And after the N-acetylcysteine fiasco 2 weeks ago, I think I put it on my story, the list of compounds that are in review with the FDA, and like you're talking citrulline, glutathione, what else? There's methylcobalamin, which is vitamin B12. All these things, pyridoxine 5-phosphate, which is vitamin B6, all looking to be reclassified as medicinal compounds. So therefore, rather than being able to prescribe, rather than able to get it from a nutrition store or a pharmacy even, it now becomes prescription class and you need it prescribed by a doctor, which to me is absolutely ridiculous. And it's sort of then coming back to this whole conspiracy that how the FDA are sort of selling N-acetylcysteine as being moved to a medicinal class is that we've had published papers where we know, like I said, glutathione plays an important part with this current situation, that if we can do anything to increase glutathione recycling, we'll have more favorable outcomes with our immune health. So on that hand, we know that, okay, yes, N-acetylcysteine could be an effective strategy for global health. But we also have, companies that are claiming that at one point before N-acetylcysteine came on the market, that it was actually a medicine and became classified as a supplement. So I think there is a petition at the moment trying to get the FDA to overrule this scenario, but it's not effectively banned just yet. We can still get it. Europe has its own different laws. So, for example, Ireland has the Irish Medicines Bureau, the IMB, and then the UK market has HMRSC. And I'm not too sure about Slovakia, but I'm sure that there is EU guidelines in place that just because the FDA has banned something doesn't effectively mean it's banned worldwide, but it does then set the precedent for all these other bureaus to effectively reschedule this compound based on how the US has deemed the compound to be medicinal. And sort of to stray from that, even astragalus, the FDA have looked to try and classify this as a medicine, basically. Or in other words, they're trying to figure out components to these herbs that can be patented, can be extracted, patented, and then therefore rule or outlaw the sale of the herb itself. And we know one of the active components of astragalus is astragaloside 4, which is just the chemical component of astragalus that has effects on telomere lengthening, so it helps to improve longevity, and it can help with rejuvenation of the kidneys. So you can see here that if the FDA can, I guess, if a company can patent that aspect of astragalus and make the plant extract, I guess, unlawful, you have a monopoly here where you just need to find a constituent of a whole plant, patent it, and go, right, you can no longer sell the whole plant because the extract within the whole plant extract is patented. But I don't think we're ever going to get to that situation. I think people are just going to try and, people will stand up and say, enough is enough. We've had these natural compounds in existence for at least 100 or so years, within the public domain. You can't just all of a sudden turn around and say, oh, well, that's a medicine and we're going to profit from it. And that is ultimately what it comes down to, just profiting from a scenario where something has effective benefit that they now realize that they can capitalize and monopolize.
Right. So. Right. And what do you think about CBD? Because in Slovakia it finally got legalized, and it's currently a big boom. And I don't know in Ireland and UK for how much CBD has been around.
So yeah, CBD has never been a classed substance in the UK or Ireland, so it's been free to purchase as a supplement. So this is sort of one of those areas where you can either be buying snake oil or you can be getting actually something that is therapeutic.
That's exactly what I've been figuring out, because I've been taking CBD for like 5 years, and I've been taking it from Czech Republic, Austria, and Switzerland, many countries, and sometimes it was like hemp oil, not even CBD, just hemp oil, and sometimes it was a really good product. And when I finally found out the product that had it stated 1,500 milligrams and it really had it, that's when I started my brand with it, because it's been really hard to really get like good brand that would really have the CBD content that stated it was
Yeah,
the.
and this was sort of where when I started looking into CBD a couple of years ago, when it started to become a little mainstream, and I knew all the papers because we'd studied the endocannabinoid system in our neuropharmacology series at college. That was like 12 years ago. I started to look at some companies were like offering CBD, but when you looked at what you were taking for the day, it was like, say, a 4% solution. And so really what you were getting with each delivery was maybe about 4 milligrams. Now,
Nothing.
you have people are saying, oh, this is fantastic, I do 6 sprays and, you're getting like 12 or 15 milligrams and this is amazing and I feel great. And you're like, well, critically, if I look at the research on CBD and using actually cannabidiol compounds, the dosage that's sort of in the literature is anywhere from like 50 milligrams up to a gram. And it's sort of like, if you're only taking a couple of sprays of a 4% solution, maybe you're getting 10 milligrams. I really don't see any benefit to what you're going to gain from that other than maybe some level of placebo. And I noticed the same then, that I had a couple of companies then when I started sharing a bit of research on CBD on my story. They said, oh, we've got this, 40% solution. Would you be willing to try it? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And then you start telling people, a 40% solution contains about 400 milligrams per serving. Very expensive. So I think like the bottles. So there's a company, UK company, Iconic CBD, that sent me some of their stuff, and they sent me certificates of analysis of the HPLC and mass spectrometry of their product to prove that, like what we're using is real. And he said, if you want, we'll send you the 20% and 40%, which is 200 and 400 milligrams per serving. Now, bear in mind, that's per 1 mil, and the bottle is 10 mils. So you're getting like 10 servings at that max dose. And then obviously then you can titrate down, 50 milligrams being sort of the lowest dose you'd use in the literature. If you sort of titrate down from a 200 milligram, you're talking an eighth of a mil. So yes, the bottle will last longer if there's only 10 servings, 10 1 mil servings in there. But like the recovery I was getting with 200 and 400 milligrams was incredible. Like I had really bad knee tendonitis last year that would just disappear. You'd take it, you'd wake up. Okay, as the CBD wears off, that effect sort of then starts to diminish. But it was almost like, you went to sleep, you woke up and the pain was gone. Like tendonitis in my elbow or tendonitis in my knees were gone. Slowly come back over a couple of days, but you dose the CBD, and again, just the pain just went away. Now, when you view tendonitis like that, there's an underlying level of inflammation, but there's also an underlying level of tension. So yes, you're correct in some of the inflammation and the pain, but if the tendon is being chronically stretched, then yes, you're going to suffer pain a couple of days later because you've never actually corrected the tendon length back to how it should be. So the CBD, anyway, when I started to see this, I was like, why are companies getting away with this like 4% or 8% solution where, it's a couple of sprays under your tongue, and you have all these influencers on Instagram saying it's the best thing ever? That when I posted about the CBD, I made it critically aware to people that, yes, this is expensive. If you're looking for something that's for chronic pain management and you don't want to go down the route of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories or any sort of pain-killing drug, then CBD might be something that you might want to consider, but you have to take into account the dose you have to take and obviously then the cost per dose. But it definitely, from my own experience, I'm following what the literature says, the devil is in the dose, and it's being willing to take that high dose.
Yeah, that's exactly like I don't have any CBD under 15%, and people like tell me, oh, it's expensive, you should make 5% and stuff. And I tell them all the time, like, I won't make it because it won't be efficient. So why should I make a product that you would just take and get nothing from it?
Yeah,
so who has the money, he can buy it. Who hasn't, just
it's like, and that was when I was putting it on my story when I was trialing it, and people were saying, "Oh, would you really rate it?" And I'm like, "Well, you have to consider a load of other things before you go down this route, but I do believe that it is an effective thing to utilize at the correct dose." So again, like you said, it comes down to economy and budget, and obviously other solutions that may need to be implemented first. Like, for example, if I'm using CBD for chronic elbow pain, it's probably better that I get the tendon issue resolved where I'm going to relieve the tension that's running down into my elbow tendon, as opposed to just taking this compound to get rid of the pain. So it's the beauty, I think, with CBD is probably in terms of dysfunctional immune function. So, for example, someone like yourself with rheumatoid arthritis or some level of,
Osteoporosis as well.
yeah, osteoporosis, anything that's sort of going to lead to an underlying disease mechanism that is going to cause maybe fragility, or I guess the likes of fibromyalgia, where we have chronic pain or chronic inflammation without any sort of known root cause. Then it might be valuable in that case where we're getting rid of that neuralgia and chronic pain.
But actually, you know what's a pity about the CBD? That a lot of the studies, they are done with CBD isolate, the crystals, and they're not done with the full spectrum CBD and with the added terpenes. That's because I've been experimenting. I've been using the isolate as I made it. You know, I have the access to the both crystals and the full spectrum. And like the full spectrum with added terpenes, the strongest cannabinoid terpenes like the myrcene or limonene, it's like 5 times as strong. I don't know, for both sleep and pain. And that's like, even I have the oil, and when I sniff it, it's like close. It's not opened yet. It's like has the seal. I can smell the terpenes through that, and it's like sealed. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah, and that's when you know. Again, that's the same with a good quality CBD. Um, won't be tasteless, and people will know that when they take it. It shouldn't be any company that sells you a CBD and there's no taste to it. Um, you know that you've got something wrong there, where there's some level of cannabinoids missing within the product, and that's where a lot of companies have tried to hide the taste with flavoring. But even with flavoring, you should still be able to taste some of the terpenes and cannabinoids underneath. You know, some people use mint flavor or fruity flavors. You should still get that aftertaste after taking the oil of the terpenes. And I guess, like you said, it's how the company's going to fully disclose what's in the product or not. And we are getting to a point now where we're starting to see, again, synergy of what you said there, of all the cannabinoids and cannabidiols playing together in terms of this global effect rather than just one isolated compound. And that's again where the beauty of herbal medicine comes into it, in that we can, yes, we can say, you know, astragalus has very good properties for the kidneys. It helps protect the kidneys in terms of the creatinine we're making in our blood being removed efficiently. But if you were to just isolate astragalus 4, it's not necessarily going to have the same effect as the whole plant extract, where the whole plant extract has thousands of molecules, thousands of constituents and compounds that work in synergy with one another. And that's obviously that area of pharmacognosy where we use herbal medicine and plants to have all these, I guess, the synergy of all the compounds within the herb playing into how it affects our body.
Exactly. Like the pharmaceutical CBD prescription medication, I think it's called Epidiolex. It's like only isolate, and it doesn't nearly as work as much as the CBD products you can get without prescription.
Yep.
And like the biggest bullshit right now, I don't know if you have it in UK, but in Slovakia and Czech Republic, it's a lot now, that you have this nano CBD, they call it, and they give you 100 milligrams of isolate, and they sell it for 50 or 60 euros. And they said that it's a nano CBD particles in water. It's not mixed in oil, it's in water, but it's like totally cheap process. You just have water, CBD isolate, and you get ultrasound blender and blend it
Yeah.
into water, and they sell it for 60 euros when the price of the manufacturer is like 3 or 4 euros. It's crazy.
Yeah,
They sell
yeah,
100 milligrams for 60 euros. No.
and it's they're trying to play into that industry of, I guess, nanotechnology that we're moving towards, with nanophospholipid like liposomes. But just because you, I guess, microsolubilize an organic compound into an aqueous extract doesn't necessarily mean that it's improving the bioavailability or delivery mechanism. It's just a cheap marketing ploy to basically try and fool the public into thinking, oh, nanoparticles, that must mean that they're actually ultra efficient versus taking just oil. And that's where, again, the education on the public needs to come in as well. We're sort of telling the public what's really happening here is just a cheap marketing tactic.
Yeah. And do you know what I think is a miracle? I have this friend who's been in the cannabis industry for like 20 years. He's like total cannabis maniac. And he told me that THC, before you smoke it, it's just THCA. If you smoke it, it's delta 9 tetrahydrocannabidiol, or if you decarboxylize it and you make edibles from it, it's a totally different chemical. But the THCA it isn't psychoactive, so it won't get you high, but yet it has like the most health benefits, even anti-cancer benefits, the most, even more than the THC when it's psychoactive. So if you would make oil from THCA, and if you take it, you won't get high, and you will get all the anti-cancer benefits. But yet you can sell it because you theoretically can make a drug from it. You just have to heat it up, and it's psychoactive.
Yeah, and that's, if people want to like look into THC containing CBD. Now, this is from years ago, but Rick Simpson was a guy in the US that sort of started Rick Simpson oil, which was, you grew specific strains of cannabis for the THC content and extracted the THC out of the plant bud. And yeah, some of the anecdotes, like you said, you see people using RSO for anti-cancer benefits, and basically as I guess the underlying theory of the cannabinoid system is that it's an inactive pathway in our body that is rarely activated day to day. But what it does end up doing is it can reset our immune system in terms of our natural killer cells to distinguish self from non-self. And effectively then that reset in immune system allows your natural killer cells to target cancer cells, to kill them off, to tell them basically die. And that's it. It's something that, like, years, it must be like 9 or 10 years ago, I read into and thought, geez, that's very interesting, but never really went back to it. But from a pharmacological perspective, like how these compounds interact within the CBD or the cannabinoid pathway in our body is I guess untapped potential, basically.
Yeah, it's fascinating, really. Okay, Doc, I'm gonna probably wrap this up because it's probably around 2 hours now. So if you would have something for the listeners to say them, and anything that they can take away from this.
Yeah, so I guess, like, overall, the whole conversation we've had really comes back to disease in society, in my opinion, can be, I'm not going to say corrected or rectified, but we can understand more critically what's happening with disease if we really think of root cause. And that goes for anything. It goes from cardiovascular disease to diabetes to high blood pressure. All these chronic illnesses in society, we can sort of go back to a root cause. I guess the one thing that we sort of touched on there at the end, and cancer for specifics, is probably the only one that we don't really have this defined or categorized root cause of why we develop cancer. Cells lose their ability to apoptose and die when they basically run to the end of their chromosome tether. So basically the cell just continues replicating indefinitely because the internal machinery is never told, okay, you're done. You've ran out of chromatin. You've ran out of, the telomere is now completely shortened, die basically. We don't really understand what turns on that process in our body. But everything else so far in terms of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, and liver disease, we have a fairly good idea on root causes that we can go to first, try and correct those. Obviously use pharmaceuticals or nutraceutical supplements to alleviate symptoms, but we should always be trying to get to that root cause. Let's heal that person from the disease, basically, rather than effectively trying to just manage quality of life. Because really, what we've sort of done with society and how we've progressed medicine is we've increased a person's lifespan. We've potentially decreased the aspect of your life, which we call disease span, where you have frailty and disease processes starting to happen. But within that sort of disease span later in life, we're never really, again, correcting the root cause to even further extend lifespan. We're just using compounds that, if you're old and frail, if you have pain in your knees, we give you painkillers to get rid of the pain in your knees so you can function day to day. If you have high blood pressure, we give, combinations of medications from diuretics to antihypertensives to ACE inhibitors to ARBs, whatever way you want to give to lower the blood pressure. That might be from either genetic, which is inevitable as we age, or it could be from obviously lifestyle and diet. We always want to strive to get to that root cause. And, like I said, we have genetic issues. So you could have familial hyperlipidemia. We have high LDL anyway. So a statin might be useful here. And we'd have to use it in order to try and offset some of that negatives and keep LDL oxidation potential lower. Or like I said there, you might have genetic issues where your ACE expression goes up as you get older. So genetically, your blood pressure is going to go up anyway. So there's sort of scenarios where conventional medicine has been great to get rid of these background symptoms that could play into further disease. But then it comes back to, after we implement those strategies, let's get to the root cause. Let's get to the lifestyle and environment and diet factors and build upon the quality of life from there. So I think I've chatted enough about the flaws of how we should marry, I guess, conventional and functional medicine together. And overall, if there's one thing to take away from this, is just to be critical with facts that are presented to you overall when it comes to your own health. And don't even take for granted my word. Don't take for granted your GP's word. If there's something wrong, take an interest in understanding and forming your own opinion from that, rather than just blindly following orders. Because I could say something and someone might not agree with it, or someone else could say something and I might not agree with it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our opinions are invalid. It's that we need to critically take on board our own opinion rather than being told, oh, you have to do this. And that's sort of another, I guess, flaw to society, is this education by authority or appeal to authority fallacy, where just because someone is in a position of being a doctor or within government or whatever, it shouldn't be necessarily that what they say is gospel either. It should be that what's given is a guideline or our opinion. You have to form your own opinion on whether that's correct or not. And hopefully we either agree or we meet somewhere in the middle.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Dean, for this amazing podcast. It was amazing. I really appreciate you having you here and you sharing the wisdom to the people. It's amazing to have someone like you in the podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Mario.
We can see what people think of it. Of course, you can share it through Instagram to help it to get as too much people as possible. We'll be very happy, and probably I would like to have you more times in this podcast if you would be interested.
Yeah, of course. I'm always happy to come back on people's podcasts.
So amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having you here, and have a nice day. And to all the listeners, thank you for listening till the end, and have a nice day as well. Bye.